Hey everyone, welcome to another full-length interview of my podcast, Where is My Mind? I'm your host, Mark Gober, and here you'll be listening to my conversation with Dr. Diane Powell. She is a practicing neuropsychiatrist, a Johns Hopkins trained MD, and a former Harvard Med School faculty member. Her research on savants, people with extraordinary mental abilities like in the movie Rain Man, will blow you away. In order for us to understand the mind, we really need to understand savant abilities, which are even acknowledged in the mainstream. The question is, how can people have such incredible mental abilities? Dr. Powell and I discuss this and more in a fascinating conversation. For more on her work, check out markgober.com/podcast for the show notes. Enjoy. I thought it would be great to start with your background in general for people who are not familiar with you. And I think what makes you extremely unique in this space is that your background is incredibly credible and mainstream, and you're arriving at conclusions that are not mainstream, but which I think are cutting edge. So I'd love to hear how you got to where you are now, and then the sorts of things that you're studying now.
Okay. So a little bit about my background. I think what's really important for people to understand is that I was really groomed to be a scientist ever since I was a small child. I had a father who had graduate degrees in 3 different science fields. The first one was marine biology. The second one was genetics. The third was physiology. And when I was born, he was doing research showing that radioactive materials were dangerous to wildlife. And this was at a time when they were still doing testing out in the open. And so we were at Hanford Reservation. And after he did that work, which was really cutting edge work and actually played a role in changing our nuclear testing policies, we went to Seattle where he did his postdoctorate in cardiovascular physiology. And he was the head of the artificial heart program at Battelle Memorial Institute. And he really taught me science. He taught me math. I was doing algebra when I was only 7 years old. And so science has always come very easily to me. And I've always been fascinated by nature. I grew up going out and spending a lot of time with other species besides human beings and becoming fascinated by how exquisitely intricate and just beautiful nature is and its design. And so for me, my first sense of there being some greater meaning to life really came through studying nature and mathematics. And I think that that's one of the reasons why my approach is so grounded. So when I went to undergraduate, I was initially in architecture because I was really interested I was also artistically gifted and was interested in combining the two, my abilities in math and physics and engineering with my artistic sense. But I became really disillusioned about the field of architecture. And it was so easy for me that I was taking courses on the side, and I fell in love with neuroscience, which was a brand new field at the time. And I studied neuroscience from several different perspectives. I studied it as a biophysicist, looking at biological systems and looking at physics and how mathematics applies to biological systems, which is a really different approach from most people who become psychiatrists, because I entered into becoming an MD neuropsychiatrist with this background as a neuroscientist in which I understood biophysics and had engaged in a lot of laboratory research as an undergraduate. I worked in a laboratory with an electron microscope. I learned how to make glass microelectrodes and insert them in the axons of crayfish and do recordings of calcium and action potentials and all sorts of things that were not just a theoretical book knowledge for me, but I actually had hands-on laboratory experience. And so my approach to neuroscience has been that of an engineer, looking at the brain and saying, if I were, say, an architect, and I used to like going to archaeological sites and seeing old structures and seeing how archaeologists thought about them, and how is it that they can look at something and say that was a bedroom and that was actually a storage room. And what I saw was that the same principles were followed within archaeology as within the study of evolution. I had studied comparative anatomy and evolution ever since I was a little child. My father taught evolution. And what I was taught was that you can learn about function by form, that the two are very related to one another. And so when looking at the brain, I'm looking at its structure and the whole system, and I'm asking myself questions like, what is it about the human brain that makes us uniquely human? What is different about us from all of the other species? What is different about human consciousness? There's no question that other animal species are highly conscious, highly aware beings. And in many ways, they're more aware of a lot of things that we're not. They see in a very different spectrum. They hear a different spectrum. So so their navigation of this universe and all of the electromagnetic frequencies that we integrate into our construction of what we think the world is, that they're integrating different frequencies from us. And so I've asked myself various questions, and the model that I've come up with for understanding human consciousness is one in which I'm very excited about it because it can explain every single unanswered question that I've run into in my career as a neuroscientist and as a neuropsychiatrist. And that's really exciting.
It is. So before we get into the actual theory itself, I would love to get into some of the phenomena that you have seen, and then maybe we can discuss how you can reconcile that with the model of the brain. And one area that I'd love to talk about, and we should talk about others too, but is your work with savants generally, and then some of their potentially psychic abilities.
Yeah, so a savant is somebody, the name comes from the Latin for knowing, and a savant is somebody who knows things, and you really don't know how they know it. It's not, if you ask them about the process, it is described by them in a very different way from how we do things. So, for example, there have been mathematical savants. There was a famous boy who, in the early 1800s, was out in a field one day. He was only 5 years old, and he started saying all of these mathematical equations. And he didn't even know how to do simple math. And he became this wonder boy and was written up in this, there was a book that came out that would list all of the newsworthy events for a particular year. And he was written about in the year 1812. And I knew about that phenomena and then ran into it again when I read Oliver Sacks' work. He talked about these two autistic twins named John and Michael. And they were identical twins who lived in an institution, and they played this game with one another in which one of them would give a 6-digit prime number, and the other twin would say the 6-digit prime number that would come immediately after that, which is a remarkable thing to do because prime numbers don't have an easy algorithm for deriving them. In order to determine if something is a prime number, you have to know that it's not divisible by anything other than itself and 1. So it's very easy to look at certain numbers and know that they're not prime numbers if they end in a 2 or they end in a 5 or in a 0. But when you start getting, or a number that's even or a 5, but when you start getting into numbers that end in a 3 or a 7, it becomes more difficult to know, are they prime or not? And what was interesting about these twins was that the way they described knowing these prime numbers was that the numbers just showed up. They just showed up in their visual field. And that struck me as really interesting because that is how people who claim to be professional psychics, that's oftentimes how they describe information arising for them, is that they just see it, either in their mind's eye or they actually see it out in physical space. And if you follow the Oliver Sacks story with these twins further, it gets even more interesting because he went and he found a prime number table and he came back with 8-digit primes, and the twins were able to, he said this 8-digit prime, and the twins were able to recognize that, oh my gosh, he knows how to get prime numbers too. And so then they immediately started generating 8-digit primes. And Oliver Sacks went back, he came back with a 10-digit prime number, 12-digit prime number. They were able to do this up to 20-digit prime numbers. And this was back in the 60s. And Oliver Sacks could only validate it up to 12 digits because the computer at the time could not do what autistic savants were doing. And yet, these young men did not know how to do simple math. They also could do calendar calculation and say what the day of the week, any date for 80,000 years was, going backwards and forwards. So I knew about these savants who knew things, but you didn't know how. And so to me, that seemed very similar to what you hear a psychic say when they say they navigate the Akashic records, that somewhere there's this information and they were accessing it. And I wanted to know, what is it about savants that makes it possible for them to do this? What's different about their brain? And I became really interested in autism because 90% of people who have savant abilities are autistic. And the other primary form of savants are what are called blind savants. So there's something about someone being blind that increases their ability to receive psychic information. And these blind savants, are typically the kind of skills that they have are musical. So a lot of people have heard of these musicians who are blind, but they are amazing at the keyboard, like Ray Charles. And what happened is that there was this blind boy who was someone who could only read the eye chart when his mother was in the room. And if she wasn't seeing the eye chart, he couldn't read it. And so the ophthalmologist figured out that this blind boy was somehow telepathic. And he did experiments with him where he had the mother and the boy separated by telephone for several miles. That ophthalmologist was a friend of a professor at Cambridge University where Rupert Sheldrake was. And it was that research with that blind boy that actually was what inspired Rupert Sheldrake to do his research on telepathy in animal species.
Didn't know that.
Yes.
Wow.
And I found out about that paper because Rupert had contacted me and said, are you doing research on children who are similar to the one that this professor did? Because it had such a profound effect on him. And I said, yes, I am. And so I saw these as two major clues, the blind savant syndrome and the autistic savant syndrome. And I wanted to know, why is it that they can access non-local information? Whether it's non-local information in someone else's mind, or it's non-local information as in prime number generation. And so one of the things that I came up with is this model in which you have to think about the brain as something that constructs a virtual reality. Are you following me with that?
So the brain is creating some visual of what the world is like?
Right. So our brain plays a role based on sensory input, on assessing what our environment is about. And it's usually focused on the here and now, our immediate location and our current time, because that's really what is most adaptive to survival, is for us to be focused on that. And that's one system within the brain, and that system is the one that has gotten the most press and the most attention, because that's the system that takes in all the sensory input from our eyes, from our skin, from our taste buds, from our nose, all of the sensory information that gets incorporated into this then reconstruction that we experience as reality. And so we're told that it's not really happening outside of us, that it's actually happening inside of our heads, but people have never been able to say how that is. We know that it's a constructed virtual reality because of certain phenomena. And one of these that we all have experienced is the fact that we all have a visual blind spot. And what's happening with the visual blind spot is that in the back of the eye, where the optic nerve leaves, there would be, if we didn't create a virtual reality, there would be a huge black hole in our visual, in what we see. But instead of having a black hole there, the brain uses all of the information of the adjacent areas and then just fills in the middle with what it expects to be there. So this is why you can get startled by something coming out of your blind spot, because you were that part of your visual field, you actually thought you were seeing it, but you weren't really seeing it. You were seeing your brain's virtual construction of what it expected to see. And another example of this is change blindness. People will continue to act as though nothing has changed when they are engaged in something and there's a disruption, and it doesn't make sense to them that it would be a different person who's talking to them like nothing changed from the other side. Once that interruption is gone, then people they don't even notice that there's been a change. And so what happens is that our mind tends to want to make sense, and it has certain expectations. And a lot of what we see or don't see is really based on what we expect to be there and what we don't expect to be there. And so one of the things that's different about autistic children and people who are blind is that they have a different set of expectations than we do. And in fact, blind people have they have a lot of workarounds that they use that are really quite interesting. And a lot of them actually claim that they think that they still see. And it's really interesting. So what they are doing is they're using a different system for creating a virtual reality that they navigate than one that's informed by the eyes.
Are you familiar with the book Mindsight, of blind individuals who have a near-death experience and have the ability to see during the NDE, and then they come back and they're blind afterwards?
Yeah, exactly. So what's happening there is that they're using this alternative system. And one of the things that's fascinating is that if a person is blind, there's never been a recorded or reported case of someone who is blind and schizophrenic. And I think that that's really interesting, because what it suggests is that they don't have a competition between these two systems, these two different ways of seeing. I've had patients say to me, so I've had these patients say things to me over the years, and I've been really trying to make sense of it. So like another thing that a patient said to me once is that he has episodes in which he concurrently sees things from his in-body perspective. At the same time, he's seeing things from up above as though he's out of his body. He's having both at the same time.
And it's a visual perception that he describes.
Right.
Wow.
So our concept of perception and visual perception is really, it's so colored by what we experience. If we don't experience that, then we don't think other people do. And if we do experience it, there's a tendency to think that other people do as well. So for example, people who have synesthesia, who always see colors. There's different types of synesthesia, but one form of it is when you always see colors around certain letters. There's one savant whose name is Daniel Tammet, and he has one of these amazing memories. And that's another thing that savants defy, is like our sense of how memory works. So Daniel Tammet can recite pi to over 22,000 digits. And the question is, how does he do that when his brain, if you look at the brain of someone who's autistic, his brain's less connected than ours. If memory is all about having like hyper connections and more connections, then why is it that a brain that is less connected actually can have a superior memory? And so what Daniel Tammet experiences is that he sees all of the numbers effortlessly, just like a ticker tape parade. But they don't come as numbers, they come as colored shapes. And he has identified each one of those different colors and shapes with a different number. And so it's just shown to him in that form. And so in people who have these kinds of experiences, they just assume other people do as well. And another savant who really defies everything is Kim Peek, and he's the savant that Rain Man was modeled after. And he wasn't really autistic, but a lot of people, they call him that because the autistic savant is the one that's the most commonly known of. But actually what Kim Peek had was he was born with hydrocephalus, which is another name for water on the brain. And if you look at Kim Peek's brain, what you see is that his left and his right hemisphere are not connected at all. And he has a big hole in the center of his brain. And yet he could recite word for word, forwards and backwards, over 12,000 books by the time he died in his 50s.
Incredible.
And he, even more remarkably, he could read 2 pages of a book simultaneously, one with each eye. He could also read 2 books simultaneously, one with each eye. So he had an experience of consciousness that was different from my patient who had the perspective from up above and through his eyes and his body. But nonetheless, it's still one of these experiences in which somehow his consciousness experience can be divided up so that he can experience 2 things simultaneously. I met one of the most accurate psychics and mediums I've ever met is a woman who does both, and her name's Laura Lynn Jackson, and she receives the information. When I asked her, well, how is it you know that it's whether it's psychic or it's coming from not another source as in a medium, and she says that if it's psychic, it's on one side, it's I think on the right, and if it's a medium, it's on the left, or vice versa. But it's which side it comes in on is the source of information. And that's like, to me, it's like, once again, it's telling me that we have more than one system. And if you think about it, all of us experience this as well when we go to sleep. Our dreaming sleep is very similar to when we're conscious in that they both have actually a very similar fast hertz brainwave activity associated with them. And during dreaming sleep, our eyes are scanning something because they're going back and forth. That's why it's called rapid eye movement sleep. But at the same time, and they're creating there's a virtual world that we navigate in our dreamscape. So I call one form of virtual reality our dreamscape. It's what we can create when our sensory system, for the most part, is tuned down. We're not using our eyes to see this world. We're using an inner eye to see another. And yet we can still, because our ears can still take in sound, we still incorporate sounds into our dreamscape. What we don't incorporate into that dreamscape is the expectations that certain things can't happen. So in our dreams, magic is real. We can fly, we can be precognitive, we can be telepathic. And what's fascinating is just like the near-death experiences in which people have information that they shouldn't be able to have. Similarly, people in their sleep have had information that, how did you have that from a dream? So the way I see it is that if you look at the brain activity when somebody is sleeping and having a dream, that is the opposite of the brain activity of somebody when they're in their waking state. And so this is how we have these 2 different virtual realities, is that it's really 2 different systems. And the dreaming state is much more reliant upon the right hemisphere of the brain. And the waking state is much more reliant upon the left hemisphere. And it's the left hemisphere that is the logical, analytical, oh, that can't happen, that's not logical. Whereas the right hemisphere is the more emotional, intuitive, anything's possible, gestalt thinking, whereas the left hemisphere is more linear thinking. And so we have these 2 very different systems, and we toggle between the 2 when we go between being awake and when we go and when we're asleep, and especially in dreaming sleep. What's interesting is that this sort of bicameral mind is something, in dolphins, if you look at a dolphin's brain, what you see is it actually looks like 2 of our brains stuck together. And the dolphin, they don't ever completely go to sleep. They just put one half to sleep while the other one's working. Then they put that to sleep while the other one's working, And so they have this back and forth between these 2 different ways of navigating. And what I'm saying is that we do too. The difference between the 2 is that the navigation that we do during the dreamscape is non-local, and the navigation we do with our sensory systems is about our more immediate here and now. So So what happens with autism is that they're shifted over to the dreamscape-like world because they have left hemisphere deficits. A lot of them have left hemisphere damage. But people who are blind are shifted over to the dreamscape world because our primary source of input to the wakingscape world is our vision. We're highly visual animals. So that's sort of that's one piece of my theory in a nutshell.
So how would a conventional neuroscientist explain the abilities of a savant? Some of the remarkable things you described, which are pretty well accepted even by conventional scientists, I would think. People talk about savants all the time, and their abilities are known. How are they explained conventionally?
They aren't. Nobody has a good explanation for them. I mean, one thing that has been said by Daryl Treffert, who's the predominant person people think of about when they think about savants. He's a psychiatrist. He's the one who was consulted for Rain Man, and he's also been very involved with Jason Padgett, who's an acquired savant. So there are some people who they're just a regular Joe, and they suffer a head injury. And Jason Padgett was one of these. He was leaving a karaoke bar, and he got mugged back in 2002. And ever since then, he's had this ease with mathematics, and he sees fractals in nature just automatically, just like the autistic savants see primes, just automatically. And so, once again, I was thrown into, well, what is it that about head injury that can cause somebody to have these abilities just pop up? Another acquired savant syndrome occurs in people who have a form of dementia in which their frontal lobes atrophy. It's called frontotemporal dementia. And your frontal lobes are the section of the brain that really judges about what's possible. It predicts about what could happen, consequences, and it inhibits the rest of the brain. There's a big inhibitory activity by the left hemisphere towards the right hemisphere, and an inhibitory activity from the front of the brain towards the back of the brain. And so that inhibition prevents some of these skills, these savant skills, from showing up. But the question is, why would removing inhibition allow these skills to appear? So the neuroscientists really don't have an explanation. And so Daryl Treffert said, well, I think it must be genetic memory. And why? Mainly just because people think about genetics. People thought genetics would explain everything. When people looked at these identical twins who were raised apart, they had so many uncanny similarities. It was like they're living parallel lives. I think that their consciousness fields are entangled, and that's why they have similar experiences. But there are people who say, well, they think that so much can be explained in the genetics. And they think, well, it must be that, sort of in a Lamarckian way, this idea that if your parents could do it, then maybe you inherited that ability as well. And it turns out that there's some evidence that genetics, actually, there is epigenetics now. We thought that Lamarck was completely crazy, and that Darwin was right, that everything is random selection. But it turns out that there is epigenetics, which is the control mechanisms for the genome. One of the things that I did was, besides studying neuroscience, neurology, and psychiatry, I also became a geneticist, because I was very interested in, could genes answer questions like this? Does DNA have the capacity to contain that kind of information within it? And I learned molecular biology, and I became part of the Human Genome Project. And I learned enough molecular biology to discover that we weren't going to get the answers there. And lo and behold, I was right. It turned out that we were expecting human beings to have, over 100,000 genes or so. When you look at how much complexity there is among human beings, how much we differ from one another. And it turns out that we only have around 20,000 genes. And when you consider that we share half of these with the plant kingdom and 98.5% of them with chimpanzees, you start to wonder, well, how much human variation can be explained by genes? And I think a good way of thinking about this is we all know how dogs come in so many varieties, right? There's I don't know how many different breeds out there.
But they're still dogs, fundamentally.
They're still dogs, but they differ in intelligence. They differ in what they look like, personalities. They differ in so many ways. And all of the diversity within dogs can be explained by just 50 genes. That's not very many. And so what really became the most interesting thing for genetics is not the genes themselves, which are only 10% of our chromosomes. It's the surrounding material, which is the junk DNA, which is really not junk DNA. That's where all the control switches are. Millions of control switches. So if there is memory that's genetically passed down, it would have to be within that system, within the epigenetic system, which is so vast, and we're just starting to wrap our heads around that. But I don't think that that's where it comes from, because a lot of these children, they don't have parents who had the kinds of skills that they have. They don't necessarily have it in their background. The little boy in the 1800s who couldn't do math, who was out in the field working, with his father. I mean, these people were farmers. I mean, do you really think that complex mathematics was in his genetics from previous ancestors? I doubt it. I really doubt it. And so I think that we have to explain everything, and we cannot explain it through genetics. So I looked to other answers, and that's when I started becoming interested in the whole issue of entanglement, which is something that I'm sure you'll have other people talk about. Dean Radin talks about entanglement a lot. It's something that we've seen in quantum physics. And when I first thought about entanglement and that applying to human beings, it didn't make sense to me unless we were talking about something like our consciousness fields. And I still feel that way. I feel that it's not necessarily our physical bodies that are entangled, but it's our consciousness fields that are.
So that brings me to another point about savants that you've looked at, which is telepathic abilities. And that's not something that to me would make sense from a genetic standpoint, because what they're accessing is completely non-local to their own body, especially if the telepathy is happening with someone who doesn't share, who's not a family member. You can't really claim that. I don't know. I think it would be a stretch. So what have you seen in terms of autistic or just savants in general who have better than normal telepathic abilities?
When you say, what have I seen?
What have you studied? Have you seen evidence that savants or autistic savants are highly telepathic?
Well, this is what I've found. This is what's interesting. And so I made the prediction that they would be. And it turns out that I've had so many parents contact me and say to me that I'm onto something, that they discovered that their autistic child was telepathic a long time ago. And so I think of telepathy as being a savant skill. So some of these kids don't necessarily have other skills, but I thought that the telepathy was a very important thing to find out whether or not they have it, because when I was testing these children for their knowledge of science and math, I started to suspect that they were maybe tapping into my knowledge of science and math. And so, and if it's, if it's telepathy, then I need to know that. And indeed, these parents all said, oh, yes, my child's telepathic. And in fact, this one child who was referred to me, named Haley, who's the child that I did the most experiments with, she was thought to be a mathematical savant initially because she was not someone who did simple math, but she could solve these complex mathematical problems. And her therapist was just her father is a psychiatrist, so he knew about savants. And so he just saw that his daughter couldn't do the simple homework, but when they jokingly gave her, a more complex problem, she got it. They thought, oh, well, maybe she's just bored and she's, really a genius. And then they kept giving her more and more complex problems. And it wasn't until the therapist who was doing this homework with her, it wasn't until her calculator that she was using to figure out what the answers were to these things, it wasn't until it changed the notation to exponential or logarithmic, and that she got an answer that was in a different notation, and then Haley typed it out in a different notation. And so she was like, what? How did you know? And then she said, are you reading my mind? And then she said, what's the name of my landlord? And then Haley typed out the name of her landlord. And she's like, oh my gosh. And then a second therapist who was working with her discovered the same thing and asked her to translate I love you into German. And she did, exactly. So clearly what's going on there is a different phenomena than the prime number generation, because I was working on a model where I was thinking initially, well, could one explain prime number generation, calendar calculation, all of these things is basically algorithms that our brain can do because our brain can function as a quantum computer. And there's lots of evidence for our brain actually functioning as a quantum computer. And I think that explains a lot of things that otherwise can't be explained. We have people like Stu Hameroff, who's very interested in structures within neurons called microtubules that he thinks are the source of that. There are people who are looking at glial cells, particularly astrocytes, which are actually twice as numerous as neurons in the brain, and they appear to have a form of internal quantum processing, and they're all highly interconnected with one another. So there's these phenomena that I was working along with this model of, well, we've got both classical and quantum functioning in the autistic brain, and what happened is that when I was working with these children and thinking, wow, well, what is it about their brain that makes it a quantum computer? And thinking, that I could then decipher, which one of these different possible theories for how the brain could do quantum computation would apply. I was struck by the fact that some of these children that I was doing these telepathy experiments with weren't even autistic. I trained with Sir Michael Rudder 30 years ago, and before autism was a really prevalent diagnosis. Back then it was 1 in 10,000 children. Now it's 1 in 59. And what's happening is a lot of children who just don't fit into this sort of usual consensual reality are just getting pushed off to the side, being labeled autistic. But if you sit down with these children, you spend time with them, you see that they're not all autistic. A lot of them instead have a sensory processing issue. And basically what's going on is that they have difficulty coordinating their body. They have difficulty knowing how to move the muscles in their body to be able to type, to be able to speak. So what they're suffering from are these apraxias and aphasias and things that I'm familiar with as a neuropsychiatrist because I've seen it in people who've had strokes. And I'm looking at these kids and talking with speech therapists and saying, you're right, what this kid is exhibiting when I read what this child can type, when you ask them questions, this is not an autistic child. This is someone who's gotten thrown into that category just because they have something that has impaired their ability to express language from a very early age on, from infancy, or certainly before the age of 2. And so then I started to realize that the kids who were the most telepathic didn't have to be autistic, that what it was is that we're probably all innately telepathic, and that what happens is that that's probably how we spend our first year of life. And that's probably what makes acquiring language so easy, because we're tapping into what somebody else is able to think at the same time they're saying a bunch of sounds that don't make much sense to us. We're actually, able to, tap into what they're thinking. And so what happens is we pair the two, and then by the time we become good, we start expressing language, that becomes the go-to method for communicating. And so we stop using the other means of communicating, but it didn't go away. So what happens is then these kids who are rendered nonverbal for one reason or another, they're not really nonverbal. They do have a language that's intact. They just have trouble expressing it. And so that was what, to me, really opened up my eyes to thinking about this whole thing very differently. And so it has to be, the model has to be something that makes it so that all of us can do this. It's not just something that's different about their brains.
So what kind of a model of consciousness would allow this kind of behavior? So if we think of the conventional model of consciousness, consciousness is produced by the brain and is localized to the brain, to the body. And what you're describing here is some kind of a non-locality where information is being accessed outside of the person's physical form. How do you think about consciousness in a very general sense that would allow for these phenomena?
Well, one of the things that I've learned is that it's really good to ask people who have these phenomenal experiences, what is it that you're experiencing? Because how they describe the experience is actually very, very valuable information. I mean, I have a whole gold mine of information that I've collected over the years from hearing what patients say to me as their inner experience that most neuroscientists don't have. And so one of the things that these children say to me is that they see the answers. And this one child said, I see the answers in my mother's mind. And what I realized what this child meant was that these children see auras. They frequently say that. And even children who, these autistic children who are, even ones that I meet in my practice, that they'll occasionally say things like, oh, I don't like that person. And you say, why? And they'll say, well, they have they have this brown color around them, and so they're actually seeing people's auras and getting a read on what kind of mood this person's in by the color of their aura, what kind of personality this person has. And so this seeing auras and then seeing information in people's auras is something that they report. And so what I think is that they are telling us that our consciousness fields extend outside of our bodies. And they extend outside of our bodies in that they contain information, and that's where they're accessing the information. So what I think happens is that there's a small percentage of people, very, very, fractional percentage of people who can see these energies, and there always have been. I mean, if you look at a lot of religious paintings that have halos, there's actually, one painting that shows a complete aura around the Mother Mary, I believe it is, and so you have people who, in cultures from Southeast Asia to the Native Americans, who all claim that we have these subtle energy bodies around us and that we have chakras and that they're visible to some people. And so it's interesting. So the claim is that they actually see the information in the visual field. And that is interesting to me because it explains why they see it as superimposed sometimes on the physical reality, because I think that some people see their own consciousness field and the information within it.
And you think that in the cases of these individuals who have impairments in certain ways, that is unleashing that which is there but blocked normally by the chatter of our logical brain?
Yes, I think what happens, so the question is, what changes the filter here? We're normally filtering out any information that doesn't have to do with what we expect in the here and now. Our brain is just automatically saying we don't need that information, too much information. And so it filters that out. But in these children who have these deficits in their, whether it's that they have a deficit in their sensory system or they have a deficit in their ability to express themselves. And in a lot of these children who are getting diagnosed as autistic, they have a combination of things. They have a combination of a sensory deficit and an inability to express themselves. And what's happening for them is that they are, it's instead of using the usual waking scape virtual reality as how they're navigating the world, they're actually using the other. And sometimes the two are happening simultaneously.
It sounds a bit like people who go into a trance, like trance mediumship, where people go into this dreamlike state and are able to access more information. Would you say that it's similar? Yeah, I would. And so, for example, one of the things to think about what are hallucinations? Okay, when a person hallucinates, one example of hallucinations that it can occur in somebody who doesn't have a psychosis is sleep paralysis. And during sleep paralysis, you have a person who's stuck in this sort of state where they're sort of halfway between a dreaming state and an awake state. And so their body is still paralyzed because when we dream, our body is paralyzed so that we don't act out our dreams. And so some people wake up and their body's still paralyzed, and they actually see these little visions above their head, these little miniature visions, of, it could be little men, it could be, all kinds of things. And it's really, they're seeing the virtual reality within their consciousness field from they're still in that sort of half asleep, half dreaming, half awake state. How do psychedelics play into all of this in terms of, I've heard the notion that psychedelics can unlock the filter, and you were just talking about the brain sort of as a filtering mechanism for consciousness. Do you think there's some relationship between the way psychedelics seem to function and your research?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. If you look at, and this is work that I discuss in my first book, The ESP Enigma, that if you look at psychedelics, what they do is they activate the deeper structures within the brain. They activate the limbic system. And the limbic system is more active during dreaming sleep than the cortical system, which is the cortical system is the outer part of the brain, the cortex, like the bark of a tree. And so what's happening is that the psychedelics flip on that dreamscape while you're awake.
Got it. So it's like an artificial induction, whereas for an autistic savant, for example, their brain is already configured in that way, and they don't need some kind of an artificial. Yeah.
That's right. So somebody looked once at the paintings of this one girl whose name was Nadia, who was this amazing artistic savant, and she just could paint these incredible paintings, and one person described them as being very similar to the shamanic cave paintings that were painted when people were doing, hallucinogenics, and, or in an altered state, a trance state. And I think that that's one way to think about these kids. It's as though they're sort of on, that section of their brain is automatically overactive.
What is the mainstream community doing to analyze these phenomena today, other than trying to consider genetic explanations, or is that basically all that's happening? Well,
I should say there's another explanation that's out there that I didn't get into and that is the reincarnation hypothesis, and that is that these kids have these abilities because in the past they were, Einstein or Newton or some Mozart. And so, and you have serious research that's actually been done on reincarnation at the University of Virginia and by a psychiatrist, Ian Stevenson. And we have another psychiatrist named Brian Weiss, who's written several books about his research on past lives, because he found that when he was talking with patients, he found that he couldn't explain some of their issues by just what had happened to them in this lifetime, that he really needed to go into past lives, and he did hypnosis with them, and they would recall these past lives. But the work by Ian Stevenson was really, really remarkable, because he looked at children, and children, when they're young, they still, it's easier, it's called the magical years, the first 5 years of life, and it's because it's easier for them to tap into that magic is real and dreams can come true kind of a way of thinking. And they oftentimes will remember or report remembering past lives, whereas an older person, that they're more amnestic for anything. And so these children who at around the age of 3 or so, report in great detail the names of all the family members, what city they lived in, everything about them, and there was no way that they could know about another family, because this was far away, and they weren't in a position to do that kind of traveling. And so Ian Stevenson would go to these countries where these reports came from, and take these children to this city and find a family with those names. And sure enough, the child was exactly right, and that family had lost a child, and the timing was exactly right. And so he wrote about this in a book called 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, and it's really profound when you look at the tables and compare the detailed information that these children gave, and then you have it validated later. Now, what is that? There's some people who they can believe in clairvoyance, remote viewing. They believe that literature, but reincarnation takes things a little too far, and so they think of this as just being superside. That these children are just really psychic, and for some reason they feel connected with that person in that life. Now, perhaps so, but perhaps reincarnation is real. I mean, I think that these are the kinds of questions that we as scientists should be asking.
Right. Even the reincarnation explanation as an alternative is not discussed in conventional circles.
That's right.
Which is unfortunate. It sounds like there was some credible evidence that should at least be investigated.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's the thing, is that scientific circles, there's enough information that's available that we can understand a lot of phenomena that mainstream science just goes, no, that's impossible. No, that can't happen. So to give you an example, and this is part of where my model in my next book will go into more details about how the science that is, I'm connecting science that's basic science that's in one arena with parapsychology. So to give you an example of what that looks like, there have been reported in multiple times throughout history. There were a group of people in the Soviet Union. Right now, there are children in India and in China, places where people claim that they can read while blindfolded. And you see these videos of these children who are, they have their finger just skimming along a book's page, and they're saying what it is they're reading. And some of these people, while blindfolded, it's not reading that they do, it's that they can tell you what color it is. And there are other people, this has been reported, actually a high percentage of people who, while blindfolded, if you put pipes made of different types of metal in their hand, they can tell you what it is, whether it's copper or some other kind of metal. because they taste it in their mouth. They taste the copper taste. And so I was thinking, well, how is this possible? This seems nuts. But then I discovered that scientists have recently found that we have rods and cones in our skin. And rods and cones are the specialized receptors for rods are for use rhodopsin, and that's for vision under low light conditions. And cones are what we use for color vision. So why do we have those in our skin? Turns out we also have 15 of the known 350 receptors for olfaction in our skin as well. So maybe that's why you can hold a pipe and taste copper, because taste and smell are very related to one another. So the thing is that we have underestimated how our sensory system works, because what we're finding is that we have specialized organs such as our eyes and our nose for smell and sight, but we also have some receptivity within our skin that enters in on a really unconscious level, but it still informs us.
And are there other species, like animals, that use their skin in this way more regularly? For us, it seems like almost a secondary thing when our eyes are working. That seems to be the primary perceptual system. But are there other types of beings that are using skin or other non-eye organs to sense?
There are, when I think of most animals, I think of, we're the only ones who have skin that's like really like human skin, and, in that sense. But one of the things that needs to be realized is that there's just so many different things that animals can do that we can't. I mean, there are a lot of animals that can see infrared, that can see UV light. There are a lot of animals so here's something that's interesting. Birds. How do they navigate? It turns out that they can actually see the magnetic field lines. They know where they are based on the angle of the magnetic field lines.
And how do we know that about them?
Because what people have done is they've known that birds use magnetite in some way for navigation, and they've done these experiments where they put like a magnet on their head and they can't navigate anymore, and they've done experiments where they reverse the magnetic field that they're in, and they see that it can affect their migration, and they have magnetite in their beaks. And so people became really interested in, well, could that act like a compass while they're flying? And what happened is that they found that the birds couldn't do it if they're blindfolded. They lose their ability. So it's not like they're sensing it in a feeling sense. They must actually be seeing it, because why would blindfolding them change it? And there are people who are sensitives who were actually studied by a neuropsychiatrist who is the late aunt of George Norrie from Coast to Coast. And she was a neuropsychiatrist in LA, and she actually studied people who saw energy fields and who could see the fields around magnets and crystals.
Wow. So human beings have the ability, sounds like, in certain cases, and it just seems normally filtered out.
That's right. So, and one of the things that when I found out that birds are navigating by actually seeing the magnetic field lines, that's one of the things that really got me excited, because because how can we prove that these people are really seeing magnetic field lines when they say they do, And so having a bird. Having it be a bird's not going to be scamming us, and I also think that these autistic children are innocent enough that they don't, that they wouldn't either, But but the thing is that when you see it in an animal, that's impressive. And then the other thing that I found very impressive in Dr. Carugula's, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and that was George Norrie's aunt, in her book, she wrote a book called Breakthrough to Creativity, and one of the things that she said in it was that this one sensitive, she could always tell which was the north and the south pole of a magnet accurately, because they had a different color frequency. The North Pole was always blue and the South Pole was always red. And so even, a magnet across the room, she'd always know. If it was a bar magnet, she'd always know which was the North and which was the South. So she must be seeing something. So I think that, and we do have magnetic receptors in our eyes. Those have been found. But once again, people thought that those were just a vestige. Well, no, we don't have such a high percentage of magnetic receptors in our eyes for no reason. And so I really think that we are, our visual system is taking in magnetic fields without us realizing that. It's just that some people have the ability to actually see them.
So it sounds like what your research is showing is that there's a combination of ordinary senses that we have that we just don't understand very well in science, and they can lead to some extraordinary capabilities. And then there are also kind of non-bodily, non-local consciousness examples that are also not well explored by science.
That's right. That's right. And another example to give you that I know about as a neurologist is terminal lucidity. Why is it that there have been thousands of cases of people who had some dementing illness like Alzheimer's, and they were totally out of it, totally couldn't function cognitively for a long period of time. And then just moments before death, they suddenly are coherent enough to pick up the phone, call their daughter, have a wonderful conversation. I mean, how is that somebody who, and so what it implies that as the brain is starting to shut down, this other system kicks in. And when this other system kicks in, it can function. It can function as well. And it actually functions better. And so I think that the way that we have thought about the human brain has been extremely naive. I mean, it's far more exquisite in terms of what it can do, and as I said, our consciousness fields they extend outside of our body, and that's something that these sensitives have said, and it appears that a lot of our understanding of things can be explained by thinking about, for example, overlapping consciousness fields. I know that for some reason, when I'm sitting, within just a couple of feet from somebody, I can oftentimes sense a lot of things about them. And people have different distances that they feel comfortable being from another person. And perhaps that's because our consciousness fields are overlapping. And we start having privacy concerns at some unconscious level. Who knows? But it's to me, it's the way to tease out a lot of these different hypotheses is to do the research. I mean, each of them has a different, each of them would have different implications in terms of what you would expect when you're testing a child.
So going back to the overlapping consciousness fields idea, what kind of an overarching metaphysics, I'll call it, would allow for something like this? In your view, based on all the different pieces of evidence you've seen for the non-locality of consciousness, what kind of broad picture of the universe would allow for that to be possible?
Well, I think that one of the things that we have to understand is that we are all interconnected. And we as human beings seem to be the ones who are the least connected of all. I mean, we're the ones who have forgotten that. And but we all are interconnected. And I wrote about this in the ESP Enigma, where I spoke about the physics that we discovered 100 years ago. I mean, when you look at the physics that Einstein and Bohr and Schrodinger and all of these different physicists, when they started talking about the universe in terms of it being a block universe, in other words, if you think of the universe as existing as space-time, where we're all familiar with the sort of landscape of the three dimensions that are physical. But if you also think of time as having like a timescape, and that if you have time and space, so they're both part of the same thing. So we call it space-time, and we are able to navigate this space-time, and we're able to find out what's going on locally because it is all interconnected. And so what points to it being interconnected? Well, some of the evidence is the evidence on entanglement, looking at if you have two paired electrons and you separate them by, it doesn't matter the distance. They could be separated, to the opposite ends of the universe. But if you alter one of them, one of the fundamental properties, such as spin of one of them, it automatically changes the other one. So they are still connected to one another. And I think one way of thinking about that is that they're still connected in multiple other dimensions, that we are not able to pick up directly the same way that we can experience and simulate the other sort of more four dimensions of, 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. That's what our brain seems to, force us for the most part to stay stuck in. But that doesn't mean that that's all that's out there. And chaos theory, is another theory that shows us the interconnectedness. That's the reason why you can have something such as a butterfly at one end, flapping its wings, cause a tornado at the other end of the earth. It's because you have this domino effect, and then it builds up. And the reason why it builds up is because it's all interconnected. You can't get a domino effect if you don't have a way in which one domino can knock down the next domino. And so there's this way in which everything has a representation everywhere within space. So that's the other thing, is that we know that we live in a holographic universe. We know that we live in one in which all of the information about everything is contained within each of its parts. And so when you have a holographic universe in which all the information is contained in each of its parts, if we are one of its parts, then we contain all of the information too.
And it's a matter of learning how to access that information. And certain children that you've worked with have brains configured in a way that allows them to access information in this holographic universe.
Right.
Yeah. So in terms of the next steps for you research-wise, or generally for the research community, what do you think are the most important areas to be focusing on?
Boy. I mean, I think that, obviously my research, I think, is the most important.
Yes. So what kinds of research do you look forward to?
I feel kind of funny saying that, but that's the reality. If I didn't think it was the most important, for me, it's just really what I relate to. And the reason why I think it's so important is because what's happening is that this condition that used to be exceedingly rare is becoming increasingly more common. And And so what we're having is more and more children that are being born on the planet that are falling into what's called the autism spectrum, and their brains work differently, and they are having these experiences that are poo-pooed by mainstream science. And so I really think that we need to understand these children. I think that they are showing us where the human race is evolving. This is where we're going. This is our future, is going to be an ability to toggle between the two systems. So I see this as I see this as something where, while we're working out, kind of evolution works this way, while you're sort of working towards something, you oftentimes get these sort of in between states, which, may not necessarily be as viable, but they're pointing the direction to which the human species itself is going. And I think that we have so many, and they're teaching us that we are evolving such that we have a lot of innate abilities that would be really cool to be able to tap into. And one of my concerns, though, is that we're becoming so enamored with artificial things and our devices, and so isolated from one another, that I'm concerned that an opportunity could be lost.
I agree with you. Are there any other scientists that are studying this aspect of children from the lens that you're taking?
Not that I'm aware of, no. And one of the problems is that so people at IONS, for example, would love to collaborate with me, but they can't because it's in their bylaws that IONS can't do research on children. And so a lot of people are put in a position in which their hands are tied for doing some research. I'm a practicing clinician who has a background in child psychiatry. And so I'm just running into these kids and assessing them and helping them and their families and things. And but at the same time doing thought experiments and collecting data.
Wow. I can only imagine the things that you see. It's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, Diane, thank you so much. Unless there's anything else you wanted to address, you covered all the topics that I was hoping to cover.
Yeah, no, that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to another full-length interview from my podcast, Where is My Mind? I hope you enjoyed it. Check out the show notes at markgober.com/podcast for more information on the guests I've interviewed. Also, don't forget to check out the show, which features clips from many of these interviews on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please tell your friends. This has been Mark Gober, and thanks for your support.